I'm glad to be here with you all. Oh, tonight, I want to kind of do more of a Bible study, and because I have a two-part series actually that I think I'm going to do. I'll do part one tonight, and then part two in a couple weeks. But it's going to largely be historical based, and I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with some of the really strong historical structures in the Old Testament and a lot of the events that happen that could be corroborated by archaeological evidence. But I always really enjoy kind of going through some of the historical narrative to learn about how things came about. It's always interesting when you start at some place in the scripture and you're in the middle of the story. The story of God's interaction with humanity, of his plan of redemption, and it's always helpful to kind of orient yourself. So part one tonight is really going to be kind of orienting ourselves historically to a lead up to my main point that I want to share, which will be part two. So you'll have to stick around in a couple of weeks when I come back around to do part two. But tonight, we're going to start in 2 Kings. 2 Kings chapter 23. And I think I'll be able to throw my screen up here so people can follow along if they don't have their Bible easily accessible. Now, at this point, we're kind of already a little bit along in our story of the Old Testament. So maybe let me back up just a second real quick. The first global empire, you might call them, the Assyrians, they basically took over the area in the Middle East, ranging from over near the eastern border toward Babylon, all the way down through what is known as Israel, down into Egypt. And they took over this whole area. And this is part of a fulfillment of prophecy, actually, where God had the prophet Isaiah. He prophesied against the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, Israel divided into two kingdoms, 10 tribes in the northern kingdom, and then you have one or two tribes, if you include Benjamin, in the southern kingdom. So the northern kingdom got prophesied against by Isaiah for their idolatry, for their wickedness. And the prophecy of Isaiah was that he was going to bring Assyria against them, and that Syria was going to be the rod of his anger, and that he would strike Israel with Assyria. And so Assyria invades Israel, and this is under the rulership of Tilgath-Pileser II, I believe. And this is somewhere in the mid-8th century that Assyria is invading Israel. And it was in specifically the year 738 that Tilgath-Pileser demanded that Samaria, which was the northern kingdom's capital, that they pay tribute to him. And you can read about this in 2 Kings chapter 15. And this went on for a couple years, but the northern kingdom ended up rebelling against Assyria, and Tilgath-Pileser moved in and invaded the northern kingdom, and people were carried off into a captivity. This was the first captivity. And this was done in order to kind of like decentralize the people. It was a common practice in the ancient world to take people and displace them as a way to disrupt their unity socially, and also to destroy their national identity. Well, this practice continued on through the subsequent kings, Shalmaneser, and the next one is Sargon, and we get down to Sennacherib ultimately, who tries to conquer the southern kingdom of Israel. So this is Assyria, the largest superpower in the ancient world at that time, and they try to conquer Jerusalem, but Sennacherib never actually gets to really conquer Jerusalem, and he withdraws and sort of like allows Jerusalem to exist in the southern kingdom on its own. But we get to then the rise of the next superpower. In this time of ancient history, what it is essentially kingdom after kingdom rising up and swallowing the one previous to it. But we get the Babylonian Empire rapidly expanding and conquering the Assyrian Empire. But let's go to the Bible now, because we're going to catch up here to 2 Kings chapter 23. And this is in the days when Assyria and Babylonia are at war with each other. In verse 28, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Josiah, King Josiah, who was the king of Judah, who led the great reform, and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? In his days, Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to help the king of Assyria at the river Euphrates. But King Josiah went out against him. However, Pharaoh Necho killed him at Megiddo when he saw him. His servants carried him dead in a chariot from Megiddo and brought him to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb." The people of the land took Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in his father's place. Jehoahaz was 23 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned only 3 months in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah. He did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, just like all the evil that his fathers had done. Pharaoh Necho took him prisoner at Riblah in the land of Hamath to keep him from reigning in Jerusalem. And he imposed a fine on the land of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold, that's pretty significant taxation. The 100 talents of silver, if you would, actually, I can probably do it here. It's like 7,500 pounds, I think. Oh, no, no, well, I got them both coming up here, but it's 7,500 pounds of silver. And then 1 talent then is 100 times less than that. Well, that's not coming up for me, but it's 75 pounds. So that's a lot of silver and a lot of gold. That's the tax that Pharaoh Necho imposed on the southern kingdom of Judah. Now we're at about the turn of the millennia here. Actually, the end of the 7th century. So the really early 600s BC, and Jehoahaz, the son of Josiah, ends up getting displaced after 3 months, only 3 months. Pharaoh Necho comes in, takes him prisoner, and then puts a heavy tax on the people of Judah. And then here, verse 34, Pharaoh Necho made Eliakim, the son of Josiah. So it took Jehoahaz's brother and puts him in place as king. And he made him, the son of Josiah, king in the place of Josiah's father, and changed his name to Jehoiakim. And he took Jehoahaz away and brought him to Egypt, and that's where Jehoahaz died. And Jehoiakim gave the silver and the gold as payment to Pharaoh. And at the command of Pharaoh, he taxed the land to give the money. He exacted the silver and the gold from the people of the land, from each person according to his assessment, to give it to Pharaoh Necho. Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Zebedah, the daughter of Pedaiah of Rumah. And he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, just like all the evil that his fathers had done. All right, now we get to enter the main nemesis, the king of Babylonia, Nebuchadnezzar. So 2 Kings 24:1, then skips ahead in a little bit of time to in the days of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He came up, and Jehoiakim became his servant for 3 years. Now, in the background behind this is the infamous Battle of Carchemish. and where the Babylonians rise to power. So as I was showing you here in the map, Babylonia began expanding its empire up to Assyria, and then wanted to, so here we go, Babylonia, they came up and they were pressuring Assyria, where Pharaoh Necho was going to come up and help Assyria then battle Babylon. But Babylon is exerting its influence more and more, and it wants, as all empires in this part of the world, it wants to own this land right here. This is the golden land of the Middle East. You know, this right here is all, this is all desert. This is all desert. You know, it's really this strip of land right here along the rivers and along the coastal edge down to Egypt. So Babylon is exerting its influence more and expanding its territory. And so they end up defeating Assyria and taking over and becoming the next global superpower. So, as I said, we had this new king on the rise who was greedy for power and land and wanted to control the whole trade territory, all the way from Babylonia up through northern Syria, down through Israel and into Egypt. He wanted to control it all, because if you control the trade routes, then you can control the money. So he comes down, but we'll get to that. We'll get to that slide next. He comes and he puts a heavy tax onto Judah. Let's continue reading here. But Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, I lost my screen, didn't I? So Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, became the servant of Nebuchadnezzar as like a vassal king. But he didn't like being, controlled by Nebuchadnezzar, and kind of decided to try to get Egypt to help him to then fight against Nebuchadnezzar. But here, verse 2 says, and Yahweh sent against him, this is Jehoiakim, raiding bands of the Chaldeans and raiding bands of the Syrians and raiding bands of the Moabites and raiding bands of the children of Ammon. And he sent them against Judah to destroy it according to the word of Yahweh that he spoke by his servants, the prophets. Now, this is the prophecy that Yahweh was going to destroy the people of Israel due to their evilness and their wickedness and by rebelling against him and turning against him. And so this is what was spoken by the prophets in their warnings. They were warning Israel to turn back to Yahweh, but the people of Israel didn't listen, and they continued in their evil ways. Surely, verse 3, at the commandment of Yahweh, this came upon Judah in order to remove them out of his sight because of the sins of Manasseh, in accordance with all that he had done, and also because of the innocent blood, and Yahweh was not willing to forgive. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoiakim and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? So Jehoiakim slept with his fathers. He basically died, and Jehoiachin, his son, reigned in his place. The king of Egypt did not come out again to his land to war, for the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, had taken all that belonged to the king of Egypt, and from the brook of Egypt to the river Euphrates. So if you remember the picture here, so essentially Babylon took all this land. This was all theirs, and the Pharaoh and the king of Egypt didn't decide to come up and do any battle. So you have Judah right here, this lone little tiny kingdom in the midst of this global empire. And Jehoiachin, he was only 18 years old when he began to reign in Jerusalem, and he reigned in Jerusalem for only 3 months again. And his mother's name was Neshuta, and the daughter of Elnathan of Jerusalem. He did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, just like all the evil that his fathers had done. Now, at that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came up to Jerusalem, and the city came under siege. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to the city while his servants were besieging it. And Jehoiachin, the king of Judah, went out in surrender to the king of Babylon, he and his mother and his servants and his leaders and his officers. And the king of Babylon took him captive in the 8th year of his reign. This was the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Now, so Nebuchadnezzar came and essentially destroyed Jerusalem. He came and he essentially ransacked it. Now, this Jehoiachin's reign, this happened in about 597 BC. I don't know if I can. 597 BC was the first attack where Nebuchadnezzar besieged the city of Jerusalem, and Jehoiachin just gives himself up, and he gets taken prisoner. And as we'll read, Nebuchadnezzar goes, he takes all the stuff out of the house of the Lord, all the treasury of the temple and the king's treasury and all the vessels of gold and everything. And also, this is a time. This is actually the second deportation. So there was a first time, and I think it's 605 BC. The first time Jews are taken out of the land. This is when Jehoiakim rebelled against Babylon, originally refusing to pay the tribute tax. Some people from the land of Israel, or Judah essentially, were captured and taken away. So this is the first, this is the second, and it won't be the last. Now, there's a good description of all the stuff that was taken from Jerusalem here. He carried out from there all the treasures of the house of Yahweh and all the treasures of the king's house, and cut in pieces all the utensils of gold in the temple of Yahweh that Solomon, king of Israel, had made, as Yahweh had said would happen. He exiled all Jerusalem, which technically not all Jerusalem in its entirety, but a large portion of Jerusalem got exiled. All the officials, all the mighty men of valor, and 10,000 captives, and all the craftsmen, smiths. No one remained except the poorest of the people of the land. He exiled Jehoiachin to Babylon, and the king's mother and the king's wives and his officers and the chief men of the land he took into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. All the men of valor, 7,000, the craftsmen, the smiths, 1,000, all of them strong and apt for war. King of Babylon brought them captive to Babylon. And in the place of Jehoiachin, the king of Babylon made Mattaniah, Jehoiachin's uncle, king in his place, and changed his name to Zedekiah. Zedekiah was 21 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 11 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Hamutal, the daughter of Jeremiah of Libnah, and he did evil in the eyes of Yahweh, just like all the evil that his fathers had done. For because of the anger of Yahweh against Jerusalem and against Judah, it came to the point that he cast them out from his presence. And then here at the end, and Zedekiah rebelled against the king of Babylon. You would think that some of these kings would have realized that trying to rebel against a superpower really doesn't work. It only works if Yahweh is on your side. But there's a whole series of kings here who did evil in the eyes of Yahweh in the pattern that was like after their fathers. So the nation of Judah continues to exist under Zedekiah's rule here after another deportation had happened. And but then Zedekiah, he rebels against the king of Babylon. And that's going to anger Nebuchadnezzar one more time. And this is going to be the last time. So let's go into chapter 25. So what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes to Jerusalem. He came with all of his army against Jerusalem. He encamped around it, and he built a siege wall around it, and the city was besieged in the 11th year of King Zedekiah. And I think the siege lasted for over 2 years. And so there was a severe famine in the 4th month, it says in verse 3, so that there was no bread. All the food reserves were gone. And then a breach was made in the city wall, and all the men of war fled at night by the route that went through the gate between the 2 walls that was by the king's garden. And the king went by the road that led to Arabah. But the army of the Chaldeans pursued them. This is the army of Babylonians. They pursued the king and overtook him in the plains of Jericho, and all his army was scattered from him. Then they took the king, carried him up to the king of Babylon, to Riblah. They pronounced judgment on him. They killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, and then put out the eyes of Zedekiah, and he bound him in bronze chains and carried him to Babylon. So this is in 586. This is the 3rd and final deportation that Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the entire city, not just looting it like he did previously, but literally destroying it, setting fire to it, breaking down the walls, and he also destroyed the temple. Not only that, the king of Judah, Zedekiah, met a very bad demise, having to watch his family be killed and being blinded by having his eyes plucked out. It was the 5th month, in verse 8, on the 7th day of the month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, when Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, servant of the king of Babylon, he came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of Yahweh and the king's house, and also all the houses of Jerusalem, every great house he burned with fire. All the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Then Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, exiled the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had defected to the king of Babylon and the rest of the multitude. But Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, left some of the poorest of the land as vineyard keepers and farmers. The Chaldeans broke into pieces the pillars of bronze that were in the house of Yahweh, and the stands and the bronze seed that were there in the house of Yahweh, and carried the bronze to Babylon. They took away the pots, the shovels, the snuffers, the spoons, and all the utensils of bronze with which the priests ministered. The captain of the guard took away the fire pans, the sprinkling bowls, and whatever was gold as gold, and whatever was of silver as silver. The 2 pillars, the 1 sea, and the stands that Solomon had made for the house of Yahweh. The bronze and all the articles was too much to weigh. The height of 1 pillar was 18 cubits, and the capital of bronze was on it, and the height of the capital was 3 cubits, with the latticework and the pomegranates on the capital around it, all of bronze, and the 2nd pillar had the same with the latticework. The captain of the guard took Sariah and the chief priest, and Zephaniah the 2nd priest, and the 3 guards of the threshold. And out of the city he took an officer who was set over the men of war, 5 men of those who see the king's face, who were present in the city, and the scribe of the commander of the army, who mustered the people of the land, and 60 men of the people of the land who were present in that city. Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, took them and brought them to the king of Babylon at Riblah. The king of Babylon struck them down and put them to death at Riblah in the land of Hamath. So Judah was exiled from off his land. This is the fate of Jerusalem at the end of King Zedekiah's reign. There had been a sequence of superpowers of the world taking over one after another. It was a dog-eat-dog world. And because of the sin of Israel, because Israel and Judah both disobeyed, Israel got invaded by Assyria and deported. And then when Babylon rose to power, Babylon came down and took over the southern kingdom of Judah, and they got deported. And the temple and all the wonderful adornment of the temple, all the capitals of bronze, all the gold and silver utensils, and everything in the temple that was used to minister before the Lord, all of it was plundered and taken away to Babylon. And all the officials and people of power were taken to the king of Babylon, and he had them killed in front of him at Riblah. So southern Judah it lies in ruins now. Jerusalem lies in ruins. God's people, the ones who, from the line of Judah, from which is prophesied, the Messiah would come, have now been displaced from the land, taken away to a foreign land. And during this time, the first wave that I mentioned in 605, this is when the prophet Daniel was taken away to Babylon. And then the second one in 597, the prophet Ezekiel, he was taken away to Babylon during that deportation. And then finally in 586, the third deportation, basically the rest of all the citizens of Judah were taken away, except it says the poorest of the citizens were left to tend to some fields. This is a dismal state for the people of God. But this is also what was prophesied of by God as a punishment for rebelling against him and turning away from him, and for not trusting in him. So that's where we're at historically. I'm gonna pause there, because really where we're going to transition to in the next part is we're going to transition to, well, what happens next? We're in the part of the story where the story is at a downhill part. We're in a low, where God's people have been decimated. What hope do they have? The prophet Jeremiah made a prophecy that Israel was going to be deported and in captivity for 70 years. But when you're in the midst of this turmoil, when you see the armies and you see the destruction, and you wonder why Yahweh did not deliver you, I'm sure there was a lot of looming doubt in the minds of the Israelites as to how are we going to live? How now shall we carry on? But they're in a foreign land under a foreign power, and Yahweh's temple has been destroyed. Their whole identity has been uprooted. So, Rob, I'm going to pause here as the end of this historical review, because this is going to set the stage for the next part, which I think is the upswing of the story, where we get to see how God does bring his people back. And particularly, I'm going to focus on an individual that I bet a lot of you may not be very familiar with, but we're going to talk a lot about him in part 2. His name is Zerubbabel.